1918, the Romanian army invaded Transylvania. They invaded and ravaged the land and the people. This had happened before many times throughout its history. For indeed, Transylvania was at the crossroads between warring empires throughout its time. In fact, one sees, going back as far as the Roman era, that the Romans conquered what was then called Dacia, conquered the land and extracted gold from its mountains and people to be slaves. The land has been ravaged many times, and yet for most of its history, the land that is called Transylvania was Hungarian. Hungarian ruled, and most of the people spoke Hungarian. Back and forth it went between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Turkish Ottoman Empire. For about 1,000 years, however, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It had but short respite from the ravages of war, short periods, times of peace, short periods such as during the reign of the one and only King John Sigismund, who ruled from 1561 to 1571. It was indeed a short time, but it was enough to ignite the Unitarian flame and to keep it going through centuries of persecution that were to follow. John's reign, as I've mentioned, was neither long nor was it typical. Transylvania is a small country, about 1/4 the size of our great state of Colorado, and yet, of course, with many more people. And in its history, as part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it was Catholic for most of its history. Catholic until about 1520, when the Protestant Reformation came to what was an intellectual and fertile land. About 1520, many of the churches converted to the Lutheran faith. And then, but a few years later, when the second wave of the Reformation came through the land, the Calvinist, many of the churches continued from Lutheran, then many new ones became Calvinist as well. And finally, there arose many others that became Unitarian. All this began with the conversion of the king, John Sigismund, such that by the end of the 15th century, by 1600, there were 500 Unitarian Universalist churches in every village throughout the land of Transylvania. How did this happen? How did we go from 0 to 500 within a few short years? How did it happen that the king was converted? It was all really due to one person, the founder, some would say, of Unitarianism, the founder certainly of Unitarianism in Transylvania. A unique and extremely capable, gifted individual by the name of Francis David. David, from early childhood, was recognized for his intellectual abilities, and so, as was the case then, was picked out for training to become a Catholic priest. So he was sent away to school, became a priest, immediately rose to the rank of rector of one of the largest schools in the area. But he was an intelligent man, a thinking man, a reformer, an innovator. And when word came through of the Reformation, he joined its bandwagon. And so he became, instead of a Catholic, a Lutheran. Because of his abilities, he immediately rose to the rank, was selected as being the leader of all of the Lutherans of Transylvania. And so he was the first Lutheran bishop in this country. Following that, as the debates of the Reformation continued throughout the land, and the Calvinists, as I said, came in next, he came to hold their position. And the primary difference between the two, remember they would argue about theological things then, was whether or not the communion was literally, the elements were literally the body and blood of Jesus Christ, which is what the Catholics and even the Lutherans said. The Calvinists said, no, it was only symbolically so. And Francis David, following in this, left the Lutheran faith and became then a Calvinist. But again, because of his clear abilities, was immediately made the bishop, the leader of the Calvinist. And so he was the only individual that we have ever found out about who became successively not a Catholic bishop, but almost a bishop, a rector, then Lutheran bishop, Calvinist bishop, and eventually the first bishop of the Unitarians. Indeed, it was said he was such a good debater that he never ever lost a debate. However, in private, he acknowledged that he did lose one. No one else knew, but in his debates with the new Calvinist, he won the debate, but when he went home, he admitted to his wife that the other man was right. And that was why he changed from Lutheran to Calvinist. Quite an eloquent man, so eloquent indeed that, as I said, he converted the king of the land, John Sigismund, in 1568. What they would argue about in these great debates were such questions as this, and these were the things that distinguished the Unitarians of the time. They argued that the notion of the Trinity, three gods, was unscriptural, that there was but one God. They also said it was unreasonable, that it made no sense to say there were three gods, nor did it make sense to persecute, to kill people because they believed something else. Francis David truly was the first of the Unitarians, at least of those that started a movement, for he was indeed a reformer. The Protestant Reformation really was about the questions of authority. Who shall decide what is right in religion? To that point, it was the church that decided. The church, the Pope, the hierarchy. The reformers said, no, power is not there. Power to decide is in the Bible. But they said power is in the Bible, the authority is in the Bible as determined by the minister. But Francis David and others said no. The source of authority in religion is not in the church, it's not in the Bible as interpreted by the minister, but in each individual conscience. And so that is what was sacred to them. And because of this, he was open to new truths and to reforms. Fortunately, this was to cost him his life. And yet, because of his ability, he started that flame of 500 churches, beginning with the king, who then, as I mentioned, in 1568 issued the first Edict of Toleration. It was the only country at the time where you could be whatever faith you were. The only country at the time where you did not have to practice, in this case, the Unitarian faith of the king. Indeed, Francis David not only converted him because of his eloquence, the story is that he converted the entire town of Kolozsvár, which is the capital of Transylvania, a town which I have recently visited, as I said, about a year and a half ago now. And you can see there the beautiful cathedral in the center of the city. And also, when you go into the Unitarian Cathedral, you see there a rock. And the story is that after Francis David converted the king in the nearby town of Turda, he came back to Kolozsvár, his hometown and the capital. And there he was asked by the people who came out from the city to say what he said, to preach what he preached to the king. And so they asked him to stand on a large rock, and there he spoke with such eloquence that it is said that that day he converted the entire town from Catholicism and Protestantism to Unitarianism. And they carried him on his shoulders into the town, drove the priest out, and made him the leader of the cathedral. And so it was that day, indeed, records do show, the cathedral changed hands, and the town and everyone in the town said they converted to Unitarianism. I have seen the rock. The story, well, it's a good story, isn't it? Perhaps it was true. The rock is there. One can see the rock. One can see the church. Unfortunately, John Sigismund died only 3 years after his conversion. And the new kings came following a twist of political family history, let us say. New kings came from Poland, from the Báthory family, who were all very devout Catholics. And repression sat in once again. The way this happened was the new king was sworn to follow in John's footsteps, that he had to allow the Unitarians to exist, the faith of King John. They, in their oath, had to affirm its right to exist. But what they did was, they codified it. They said, okay, what did King John say? What did Francis David preach on that day? And they wrote it all down, and they said, yes, you may believe this, but make no changes. But nothing more. Well, my friends, these people really were our predecessors. Never content to believe anything as it was set down at any one time, soon they started saying new things. But innovation then, any change, was to become a crime. You could believe what King John said he believed. You could believe what Francis David preached in 68. But just a few years later, when John Sigismund was dead, and when Francis David's mind was reaching for more truth, and new arguments came to the fore for the Unitarian faith, so it was he was arrested and imprisoned. He was a reformer, he was a Unitarian, he was an innovator. The argument that led to his demise, interestingly enough, when you think it means so little to us, but in those days it meant death, was the issue of the adoration versus the invocation of Jesus. If Jesus, as they said, was not God, but a good man who saves us by his example, by teaching us how to live, therefore, Francis David said, we should not be invoking Jesus' name to save us. The same thing the Protestants said, that you should not invoke Mary's name. Mary was to be adored, but not invoked, for she was not God. And so David said, in our Unitarian faith, we may pray to Jesus if we would like to, but we may not invoke his name that he would save us. For this he was imprisoned, put in the dungeon of a castle in Diva, some 50 miles from Kołobrzeg. And there he died, November 15th, 1579. And yet his words in the congregations lived on. Egy az Isten, God is one. That was the rallying cry. And in almost every Unitarian church in Transylvania to this day, one may see these words etched above the door or above the pulpit. 500 churches by 1600. And yet, with the persecution of the Báthory and those who followed, by 1800 that number had dwindled to only 120 churches. For example, Sigmund Báthory, who immediately, upon the invocation adoration controversy, had 11 Unitarian noble people of Kołobrzeg arrested and killed. For his efforts was made a Catholic cardinal. The persecution continued. No invocation, no change. They had to keep only that statement of faith. They were allowed no new leadership to be developed. They could not repair their churches for years and years, even if there was a fire that happened. The bishop could not travel to ordain new ministers. Only Lutheran or Calvinist ministers could ordain a Unitarian minister. They had to invoke Jesus' name at least once every Sunday. Someone would be in the congregation to make sure this happened. They had to celebrate and follow the Catholic calendar of the church year, whether they believed in it or not. This continued for years and years, coming to the point, for example, under the Hungarian-Austrian Empress Maria Theresa, who ruled, as many of you may know, with an iron hand to the point where she established a fund, the purpose of which was to kidnap Unitarian children from Transylvania, that they may be taken to be brought up in good Catholic families, to be raised Catholic and not Unitarian. May we imagine our children sitting here once again as they were a few moments before, and imagine what the parents then felt when their children at any moment might have been kidnapped from their town, taken away to be raised as good children, theoretically, of another faith. The rich, many of the rich deserted under this pressure, as rich often do, following money instead of principles. But the common people continued in their faith. And so it is that most of our churches are in little peasant villages to this day. For the rich were given many opportunities, if they would convert back to Catholicism or even one of the other Protestant faiths and give up their Unitarian faith. I mentioned a cathedral that one can see to this day, a beautiful cathedral. For 150 years, the Unitarian Cathedral of Kolosevar. If you look on a map to this day, the town name is Cluj-Napoca, for the Romanians changed all of the names when they took it over. It's in the northern area of that country. Well, this cathedral, as I said, for 150 years was a Unitarian cathedral until under Maria Theresa, the Catholic army came in and took it over and made it once again Catholic, putting the Jesuit priest in charge of it. Now, you may say, well, this was difficult for their faith, but it meant much more than that. For in those days, and the Unitarians, mind you, were not just peasants, but the wealthy people as well. And in those days, there were not banks where you kept your goods. You kept your goods in the basement of the church. That was, in a sense, the vault for the wealth of its members. And when the Catholic armies of Maria Theresa came in and took over the cathedral, they, of course, confiscated everything inside. So the people not only lost the cathedral, but any wealth they had stored there. Imagine once again how we would feel in such conditions. This was 1716. The persecution continued under the Jesuits until finally in 1780, when Maria Theresa's own son, Joseph II, who succeeded her, drove the Jesuits out and allowed some degree at least of freedom, such that the Unitarians did not get their cathedral back, but were allowed to build a new one in 1796, a lovely building again, one that I have seen. Finally, in 1848, with the revolutions that swept all of Europe, including this country of Transylvania, some degree of religious freedom was returned. But then in 1918, as part of the Treaty of Trianon signed at Paris, as part of the punishment to the Austro-Hungarian Empire for having started World War I, that this land of Transylvania was taken away from that empire and given to the Romanians. Now, many of the people there were Hungarian, but there were also many by this time who were Romanian, and so they claimed, as many people do, whether in Kuwait or other countries, that this land was originally ours. And so it was at that time that the land became Romanian and is to this day. Today there are approximately 80,000 Unitarians there still in those 120 churches. There were also about 8,000 Unitarians in Hungary in some 13, 14 churches. All of the Unitarians in Romania are Hungarian. And I'll say a little bit more later about what that means. There are ethnic differences here, which are the major problems there today. All of the Unitarians are Hungarians and speak Hungarian, and in fact, during the days of Ceausescu, the only place they were allowed to speak Hungarian, besides, I suppose, in the privacy of their own home with their family, was in church. Only in their churches were they allowed that freedom. So it is that I'd like to share a little bit about Hungary and the Unitarians there, and about my recent visit. Budapest is a beautiful city, the city of lights. Some liken it to a Paris, for example. Wanted to go to Budapest to study the Unitarian history there, but also because of some personal connections with the city as well. My wife's Patty, her mother is a Hungarian Gypsy Jew extraction, and she was taken by the Nazis from Budapest when they came through and sent to a women's camp that was near Dachau. She survived that camp, came to this country and met Patty's father, and eventually had Patty and her brother. And so it was that part of the joy of our trip was to meet with Patty and her mother there in Budapest, and for us to show us where she lived and something of the city from which she had been taken. We walked around the city, as I said, a beautiful city, but you still can see the effects of the war with buildings where bombs had blown parts of buildings away and things like this. It is nevertheless a beautiful city, and the Unitarians there have a lovely, though small, church in the center of the city. We were fortunate I met with the bishop, and one of the bishops of whom spoke English, to learn more about Unitarianism there. And we also stayed for 2 weeks with two young Unitarian refugees who had escaped from Romania. One of them had escaped by marriage, and the other one had left, a marriage of convenience. The other one had left on a vacation trip and just never returned to Romania. The conditions even in Hungary, however, are difficult. To this day. For example, they made $120 a month at their jobs. And things cost as much, in a sense, a little less for public transportation and things like that, but clothing and other things cost almost what they do here. The Hungarian Communist Party, which now fortunately is out of power, up until just recently also ruled religion just as Ceausescu did in Romania, such that they, for example, could have no Bible classes. They tried to start such a class even just to consider that. It was not allowed. All religion there was regulated by what was called the Ministry of Cults. They were not allowed but a very limited number of students to study for the ministry. Subtle forms of persecution that they hoped would keep them in check, if not eventually lead to their demise. The conditions were bad in Budapest. They were unfortunately even much worse in Romania. It is now about a year and 4 months since my visit, and I'd like to share something of that visit. We left Budapest with some trepidation. Ceausescu was still in power. The day before we left, I saw in the newspaper in Budapest 2 stories. One of them was about the fence that Ceausescu had put up to stop people from escaping. And another was about a woman and 2 children who had tried to escape by swimming a river between Romania and Hungary and who were shot. Both women and 2 children were shot while swimming the river by the border guards. Some people, let us say, it added to the excitement of our trip to go across that border. We were told by the Hungarians that it would be useful to take along some things that were, as I said, important on the black market that might help us get across the border more quickly. And so we were told to take cigarettes, chocolate, and coffee. Well, my friends, I can't give cigarettes to anyone. I just couldn't do the Kents. But I did take chocolate and coffee. The problem was we were supposed to, I understood, bribe the border guards. I don't know about all of you, but I'm not very good at bribing. We don't do that much here. I'm not just very aware on how to do it. And so when we got to the border, I started to bribe the wrong guards, the Hungarian guards. And they started pointing. They knew they weren't the ones who were supposed to get the bribe, and they were pointing. So finally, in the confusion, I left the bag of coffee and chocolate on my seat, assuming they would take it. They were very difficult, but mostly just in a bureaucratic fashion. We spent almost 3 hours waiting to get through the border while they, mostly talked. They would check when they found out I was a minister, not knowing quite what kind, I guess. They checked all of our luggage, looking to see if we were sneaking Bibles into the country. fat chance. Little did they know. But anyway, they did check for that. They checked for other things. By the time the 3 hours went by, we were so angry with them. And again, no one spoke English, and it was very difficult communicating, and they were not very nice people, clearly at all, that I decided there's no way I'm bribing these people. And so I took the coffee and sort of closed the bag up and hid it in the back seat. The coffee and the chocolate. And one of the greatest delights we had on entering the country was the fact that instead of giving these goods to the border guards, the first village we entered, we saw peasants, and my friends, this is a poor country with ox-drawn carts, with people cutting the grass with scythes on the side of the road that their animals might eat. And there were peasants all along the road who would wave to us as we entered the town, for we had a Peugeot, rented a French car. And this was different, something they had not seen much in these days. They would wave to us. And our greatest joy in some ways was to stop in the first village and to hand out coffee and chocolate to people who were just ecstatic, knowing we had been able to give it to the people instead of to the guards. So it was we made our way to Kolozsvár, to Cluj-Napoca, and quite frightening arriving there as it was dusk. There was electricity only occasionally, and so there was 1 or 2 street lights, none of them working at all. There was a stoplight, nothing working at all. The streets growing dark. Again, when they saw our car, people would swarm asking for dollars, for chocolate, for coffee, to change money. We found the Unitarian headquarters, but to our surprise, what had been a massive, big building, the Unitarian College and Church, had become, by this point, primarily a Communist Party headquarters with many different offices for the Communist Party and their Youth League and the Russian Youth League and everything like that, and just a few small offices set aside there for the Unitarians. We found it. We then searched for a hotel. It was very difficult, for you could only stay in certain hotels. One can only wonder why. We did, however, get to our hotel. And then one of the more interesting things that happened, indicating what conditions are like then, and my friends, they have not changed to this day much. We went down to the restaurant. It was a lovely looking restaurant. It looked like Vienna in 1850, you can imagine from the movies you've seen. We noticed that there were tables with some people. The waiter had on coat and tails, though ragged, nevertheless it looked elegant. However, we did notice something strange, and that was that no one or not many people seemed to be eating. Now, in truth, it's probably because they really didn't have much money, and they were not able to do that. There were very, very few tourists. We saw none while we were there. We were very special because of that, and people would stop and stare at us in the street. Obviously Americans coming from abroad. We went into the restaurant, hungry of our arduous experience of driving in these very difficult conditions I've mentioned, dodging ox carts and all. And we sat down and asked to see the menu. Well, of course, the man spoke no English, but he knew the word menu. And he said, "No menu, no menu." Well, we should have known. He said, "No menu, menu?" Well, of course, we didn't know what to make of this. Fortunately, there was one woman in the hotel we had met who spoke some English. It was her only day. She was off the next 2 days, but that day she was there. And so we took the waiter to this woman to have her translate the menu. The only thing on the menu for that evening was liver and tongue. We ate some tomatoes, some cucumbers, some cheese, and that was about it. Nevertheless, we did sleep well that night. The next day we met with the Unitarian bishop, and then were fortunate, after a couple of hours of meeting, to be taken by 2 Unitarian ministers to travel in the villages of Transylvania, which is what I'd really wanted to see, for I had heard that there were villages in which the entire village is a Unitarian village. Here was such a minority. I wanted to have that experience of being among people where everyone in the town is a Unitarian. And so it was that we went from village to village to village with one church on top of the hill, with every person in that village sharing the same Unitarian faith. We had a lovely time. We were welcomed warmly and openly. In fact, one of my favorite stories was a town, Couvain is the name, in which we met in the parsonage across the street from the church. This is a home, and remember, these are remote villages with no electricity, no running water. They cook on a wood-burning stove, kerosene lamps. We sat down, had some shibboleths, which they all seem to drink, and it makes conviviality. It's a peach brandy that they are able to make. And we sat talking with the minister and his wife and his family as it grew dark. He said, "Please stay for dinner. I'll kill a chicken." My friends, there was a great honor, for these people might eat a week or more, a full family, on one chicken. We did not stay. It is not permitted to stay in a home. No foreigner, even a family member, is allowed to stay in a home overnight. All contact with a foreigner had to be reported to the authorities. In fact, it was but some 5 miles from that very village, in the middle of nowhere on a dirt road, that we were stopped by a Securitate policeman who took our passports. We, of course, had no idea what he was saying. Our two Unitarian Hungarian ministers spoke Romanian. We were able to talk with him. One of the ministers frightened us because all he kept saying, whispering to us, was Gestapo, Gestapo, Gestapo. And we're wondering what it's all about. It was about a 45 minutes detention. They filed a form. They let us go. Fortunately, we had our passports with us at the time. As it turned out, I understand later that this was something the Securitate did regularly. They weren't going to arrest Americans and imprison us. We didn't know that, of course, at the time. They did this to let you know that they knew where you were. So it was that we returned to the town of Kolosevar. I had, in the meantime, changed money on the black market. I like to experiment. I was able to get 4 times what I got on the regular market. The problem was I had a handful of bills. I was rich, I thought, but there was nothing to buy. Nothing to buy. The stores had a few things in the windows of canned goods from other countries, but they were not for sale. They were for show. There were many bookstores in Kolosevar, surprising how many bookstores, until one looked to see that every book in the store was either by or about Ceausescu. I had money with nothing to buy. I tried to pay my hotel bill with it, and the woman said, "Your records show you've not changed enough money officially to be able to pay this bill." And though she could see I had money in my hands, she said, "You have none, give me dollars," and we did. Nevertheless, I felt the least I could do was take our 2 minister guides out for a fine dinner. And so I said to them, "My friends, we'd like to take you to the finest restaurant in town. Money is no object. The best restaurant in town, where should we go?" They said, "Let's go to the restaurant at the hotel." I said, No, let's not do that. Let's go to a better restaurant." They said, "That is the best restaurant in town." So it was, we ate something there that night. I don't know quite what it was. We then, within a few days, rushed back to Budapest, which appeared at this point to be a city indeed of freedom and of light, and is becoming somewhat more so. And yet the conditions there, my friends, are still very dire. One of the saddest things in my reading at Oxford, England, of the history of Unitarianism in England and of Hungary and Romania, one of the saddest things I saw was the fact that the Unitarians in Transylvania did not even know there were other Unitarians anywhere until the year 1825, when some traveling English Unitarians made contact with them. And they wrote in their books how much this meant to them to know that they were not alone, for to this point they thought they were the only Unitarians in the wide world, and they had suffered persecution, as I've told you, for centuries there. And what it meant to them to know that they were not alone. My friends, we are not alone. There are Unitarians in other countries who suffer under great oppression. Good, kind, loving people. People who are our brothers and sisters in the faith. These people have thrown off the oppression of Ceausescu, but the oppression there is still almost as strong today. Part of it, as I've mentioned, because of the Hungarian-Romanian differences, such that the Hungarians are often abused. There have even been several mobs that have killed some of them, some of the cities of Transylvania. Very difficult conditions to this day. I've established a sister church relationship between First Universalists and Couvent. We write, we send packages, we never know if they get anything. The conditions are very difficult to this day. Some freedom, but still much oppression. Sometimes we say, well, yes, they have the same name, but they believe something different. What they basically believe is that they are Christians, but their Christianity, I think, is a kind that we all could relate to as well. And that is, the Christianity to them means that they follow the example of Jesus, the great teacher, they would call him. That they follow his moral example of giving. And so it is, I would suggest, that we too are not alone. We have brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. And we too, I hope and trust, follow that example of giving. Amen. I'd like to take a few moments to see if anyone has any questions or comments that you'd like to raise about the Unitarians in Romania and Transylvania. Yes? Okay. This money for the collection today will go to the UUA, which has a fund which goes directly to the Unitarian Church in Kolozsvár. They are able to get it to the church. Getting things to individuals is the problem. The kind of thing that the money will go for example, is not as much for individuals. They have individuals who live in very dire circumstances, and yet, to tell you the truth, they're somewhat used to that. Most of the money will go for institutional building. Remember, if the roof leaked, they were not allowed to fix the roof. They were not allowed to have books, a very small number of books. And so most of the money from the UUA Transylvanian Relief Fund goes to try to build up the churches as institutions, and the institution, the theological school there, needs books, it needs a copy machine, a typewriter, things like that. And that's where most of the funds would go. In terms of sending things to individuals, one doesn't know. I have sent letters, I have gotten responses, but you never know what makes it and what doesn't make it. I sent a package about almost 8 months ago, and I've written then a letter, did you get the package? I've written 2 letters since then, did you get the package? I've not had a response. I did get 1 letter, but it didn't mention any packages at all, so I don't know. This, however, is able to transfer directly to banks in the names of the institutions, and that's why they do have that fund. I wish there were ways to get things to individuals, and perhaps some of it will, but it's mostly for the building up of the churches. Yes?
Approximately a year ago, this church, through the Social Responsibility Committee, responded to a California request for a computer fund that could be sent $100 to California. Do you know anything about that for Transylvania?
I assume there is a professor, and I can't remember his name right now, at Chico State University, and his wife is a Hungarian Unitarian, and they have traveled there, and I assume But that's what that was dealing with, was trying maybe to get them a computer or something. They don't have a lot of things. And I really did not hear anything about that, so I'm not sure. But that would be one possibility of where that money went and what it was for. Any other comments or questions?
Do you know what
yes,
the
please.
situation is with the orphanages? Is it still about just as bad as it was? And all the babies?
Well, the situation is still bad. Remember, these things don't change overnight. The orphanages, fortunately, are the kind of thing that get publicity now, and so a lot of people and organizations are working to help them. For example, right here in Denver, we have something called the Freedom Lift, which was started by the president of Apache Corporation, which is headquartered here. And they are collecting from businesses, companies, things that they are sending to Romania, most of which is going to help the orphanages. So they're getting some assistance. However, the AIDS, the neglect, the problems will last forever. It's so strange to see the effects of things. The people, for example, were very, very paranoid. And they would tell us, don't talk in your hotel room. We can't talk in the restaurant. This is bugged. When I tried to give, I kept some chocolate and some coffee to give to the two Unitarian ministers. They had us walk down a dark alley to do that. There was no problem. The street lights weren't working, so it was dark all over. But the fear, they would see someone and they were like frightened people. We're not used to this. They lived with such paranoia. And now even that Ceausescu is gone, there is still fear of things they cannot talk about. Primarily the ethnic strife and the differences there. And these traits do not go away. And the effects of such oppression for so long do not just go away. So the orphanages are getting some assistance, but they're horrible conditions. The people there, for example, I remember the one minister saying to us, he said, I once saw a banana. I've never eaten one, but my children have never in their lives seen a banana. And the kind of things that we take so for granted, they've all of their lives have lived without. And so the effects, it'll take some time before they get bananas there. And for their children to recover from the effects of such oppression. Well, I thank you all. And I guess, John, do you need to say something more about that with the envelopes? Or?
If you'd like to make a contribution to the Translating Relief Fund, you should put it in this little white envelope which came with your program and make the checks to Jefferson Unitarian Church with the notation Transylvanian Relief Fund, or you may also put in cash. There is a change in the program this morning for the music for the offertory. The offertory music will be Romanian Dances by Bela Bartok, played by Cara Lang and Lydia Bell.